Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone listening to this session of Shaping Mobility webinar series. This webinar will focus on the changes which happened in urban mobility due to the coronavirus. And I'm happy to see that there's many people joining this webinar from the US and from abroad. My name is Arjen van Andel. I'm the Director of Smart Mobility Solutions at the PTV Group. PTV Group is a mobility software developer. So we optimize the movement of people and goods. We work with consulting firms, universities, cities, counties, states, nations, and entire continents to design and operate mobility space and assist them in determining the possible and probable outcomes of all the unknowns which are now ahead of us. So before we start, I have a few housekeeping notes. So if you have difficulties with the audio, please quit your session, log in again. If you have any questions, you can type them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel on the right of your screen. We will try to answer all the questions toward the end of the session, so the last 10 minutes are for the answering of the questions. For those who cannot attend the entire webinar, it's not a problem. We can send you the recording after the session ends. So with that, I will start the official part of this webinar. And today we have some exciting guests in the webinar, so I will be introducing them. First, I will start with Susan Shaheen. She is a professor for civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. She is a pioneer and thought leader in the future mobility strategies. She's the vice chair of the TRB Executive Committee. So I would say make sure you follow her weekly blog and you will always be informed about the latest news in shared mobility. And then Tilly Chang is the executive director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. The Transportation Authority mission is to make travel safer, healthier, and easier for all. The agency plans, funds, and delivers local and regional projects to improve the travel choices for residents, commuters, visitors throughout the city. And Tilly has been very engaged in ensuring equitable access to jobs, education, and healthcare, especially for the essential workers in the San Francisco region. And I personally think there's a few regions in the nations only who have been seeing such drastic changes in travel behaviors and changes in transit services as her service area, right? Jarvis Murray is the administrator for the for-hire transportation at the city of Los Angeles. He is in charge of policies, regulation, and enforcement related to for-hire modes. So during our last session, Jarvis told us how his department was able to create many innovations for bike and scooter sharing and start partnerships to improve the quality of services and improve information and data available for shared services. So I'm very curious to hear what the follow-up is in this session and everything that has changed. Lastly, Randy Iwasaki is the executive director of the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, which manages the transportation in the county, and the county is very close to San Francisco for the people who are not familiar with Contra Costa County. Randy is always in the international forefront of the innovation, and I have to give him the credits for the session because he organized the Redefining Mobility Conference on March 10th. It's yesterday, 5 months ago, and at that time, Jarvis and I, we had to cancel our flights, but the morning off, basically. And Randy said, okay, let's make this happen, and we're going to do it digital. And I think arguably at this time, I would say we were the first remote conference meeting with the micromobility expanding our transportation landscape, and how much has happened since that day. So, all right, it's amazing. So for the Reimagined American City as the topic of this session, we believe there was no better option than to have the same panel back and discuss what the impact was of COVID from the last day that we could travel until today, and see what the impact is on mobility impacts of the American city. So with that, I would like to bring it to the discussion, of course, with all of us, because I'm sure that the listeners are interested to hear your views on all those changes that have happened since basically our session on March 10. And even if they would not have participated, I think many people knew what the world looked like on March 10. But what has happened since that time? And I would just like to ask each of you, like giving an overview about some of the topics that you've seen changing. And then during the discussion later this hour, we'll bring them up in a little bit of more detail. So maybe I can start with Susan. I mean, you have been in the research forefront. I'm sure that your research program doesn't look the same as it did on March 10 anymore. So can you highlight a little bit of the changes you've seen so far?
Sure, but I'd like to start just by thanking you, Ariane and PTV, for inviting us, and of course, Randy, for bringing us all together on March 10th. It seems almost a different world that we were living in back then compared to today. And so there's been a lot of disruptions, and they came pretty rapidly right after March 10th, actually. So we've seen massive changes to the economy in terms of recession and devastating impacts on transportation. And the transportation space, as always, is dynamic. And so what we've seen is a tumbling down of both vehicle miles traveled and car use right in that March-April timeframe, and public transit ridership trends followed right along with that. But with the recovery coming back from COVID, we're seeing an uptick in the use of our roads. And VMT isn't quite back to where it was normally, but it's very, very close. And public transit ridership has gone up, but not at the same rate that we're seeing car use increasing. So we're hearing that people are going back and buying used cars. We're seeing drivers being a little bit more reckless, so maybe rates of collisions were down, but the severity of crashes had gone up. And in the area that I've studied the most across my career, we've seen really dramatic effects to the shared mobility industry. You know, some positive, like in the area of micromobility, it looks like micromobility, so the use of shared scooters and shared bikes may be on the rise overall. And we're also seeing some indication from early empirical evidence that the length of those trips may be increasing. So we might be seeing different use cases alongside having more of our streets dedicated to active transportation. But we've also seen in shared mobility other areas like the sharing of a transportation network company vehicle like Uber or Lyft or pooling really being decreased. And we've also seen dramatic uptake in goods delivery and even how we're managing our curb space as a result. So lots of changes. The last thing I want to mention in providing just a high-level overview is we've heard a great deal of focus and attention on racial justice and a lot more discussion about social inequity because COVID-19, I think, has really brought this to the forefront. And we can see it in the economic recession, but also in travel patterns of essential workers and vulnerable populations.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So many changes in so little time. Huh? Who would have thought that the 20-year transportation plan would have been realized in 5 months, right? But hey, here we are. Tilly, what's your take on this? Because you've seen this, of course, all the way in the city of San Francisco with so many changes happening there. Can you give some kind of an overview about all the changes that happened in your city with all those high-tech companies out there, but also highlighting the disparity possibly that happened?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ariane, for having me, and good morning, everyone. The story from San Francisco is very much like what Susan just described. In many ways, we are fortunate to be more resilient than others, perhaps because we do have such an extensive transit system, but that transit system is certainly under strain. Quickly after the pandemic hit and the shelter-in-place health order went in, our Director of Transportation, Jeff Tumlin, our sister agency, Muni, had to make some tough choices, like a lot of other transit systems, and had dramatic service cuts, both BART, Muni, in fact, many other transit agencies around the Bay Area. And that was a function of the need to really prioritize essential trips, but also the operator availability. So it was a twin sort of effect of the pandemic early on. Our metro system went down, our BART service hours were cut after 9 p.m. and dramatically during the day. And even now, about 40 of our Muni lines are not in service. The good news is that many of those operators have begun to come back, and different protocols are being established throughout the Bay Area Our Metropolitan Transportation Commission is leading a Blue Ribbon Task Force, a transit task force, first to allocate some very much needed federal funds from CARES Act, and we're hoping for another tranche, of course, from Congress. And then secondly, they're looking at protocols for operators and transit riders. And third, they'll be focusing on what is the essential transit network in the Bay Area. How do we provide for those who really rely on transit to get around and are transit dependent, for their jobs at hospitals and at restaurants and whatnot as we're starting to reopen, as well as seniors and others who need to use transit for their medical appointments. In that regard, San Francisco has also been a leader, I feel. Our sister agency, again, SFMTA, created things like the Essential Trip Card that are helping seniors and those that qualify in terms of income with reimbursable taxi rides. Our agency funded an emergency ride home program through the SF Environment, Department of Environment, and that is funded by the Air District to, again, allow for rides home, particularly when you get off work at night and say BART is not available anymore to get home to the East Bay after 9 p.m. In addition, we have slow streets, we have open streets. Many cities are doing this, of course. It's been tremendously popular, just an ability to have open space and public health options for folks to get some exercise, and also to support businesses as we recover. So our Open Streets program was followed by our Shared Spaces program, and that again is a partnership between SFMTA and our Public Works Department to open up some curb space, not only for pick up and drop off, but also for seating and cafe space, so that businesses can reopen and offer some commercial opportunities. So those are in the parking lane or in the bicycle lane. Finally, the Slow Streets Network, I'll just mention, is again becoming a network of active transportation. So these are some really promising signs. In addition, we're also, through our economic task force, talking with all sizes of businesses, from the largest, many of whom are still working from home, and we need them to keep working from home in order to preserve and prioritize our transit capacity for essential trips, down to the medium and smaller sized businesses, really trying to help balance their worker needs and their customer needs as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. There are so many things happening. I mean, open streets, and as you're saying, slow streets. I think last time when we were getting together, we said like, hey, if those modes that you give the space basically will also be used. And I think we see that more and more, right? We give more space to the bikers, and suddenly there's everyone using the bicycles. I cannot buy a bicycle. Luckily, I have already 6 bicycles. So, but there's a lot of people that don't. And when I go to the bike store, you see like that they are just sold out. But by making more,
it's very hard to find.
Right, it's impossible, right? And I mean, but making those slow streets and open streets creates so many more opportunities. And it's the first time in my city that I've been able to go to outdoor terraces, which were always forbidden in the past because the stores were saying we want to have the people parking in front of our store, and now it's not possible anymore. So the quality of living in my little town have some uptick as well. You see a lot more people outside. It's fantastic, of course, to hear that. So Randy, do you have some overviews there as well, and what you hear like in Contra Costa County? Of course, you have maybe a different environment than the city. So can you highlight what has happened since March in Contra Costa County?
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me. I appreciate the invite and being participating with my friends here. It's been a crazy time for sure here in our county. We're a suburb kind of San Francisco. We have a lot of residents that get to work in San Francisco and come home. We try to, one of the things that we see now is with the volumes of traffic through March through now, we're way down. We actually oversee all facets of project delivery, and so including construction on the state highway system and interstate system in our county. And so we have a couple of major projects under construction. One is we're widening Interstate 680. And so we got to take those noisy kind of activities that are typically done at night, because all the work on the interstate's done during the night. And we asked our partners at Caltrans, can we work during the day? And they said, okay. And so we moved some of that nighttime activities to daytime, and we were able to accelerate the construction of our Interstate 680 HOV lane by 1 year. And so we're going to finish, instead of late next year, we're going to open that road up early or very soon here in October of this year. So that's one of the, with every disaster, there's a lot of opportunity. I think Tilly mentioned this, and so did Susan, but re-envisioning our streets. And so where it used to be a heavily trafficked roadway, some of the cities in the Bay Area have closed their major roads. They've actually made it bike and pedestrian only, which has put pressure on us at the authority to make sure that we have connectivity. And so how do we provide the right projects to allow for better biking opportunities, better pedestrian opportunities, and so more along the lines of complete streets. And so we're excited about re-envisioning our streets for, as Tilly mentioned, pickup and drop off. We have a great opportunity out in front of our office where we see a lot of delivery trucks. They're parked on the curb and you know, they're up delivering packages into the buildings. And we really should think about making those park and drop off kind of zones. And then on the other side of the street, we have a golden opportunity to put a two-way protected bike lane in instead of building another lane. And so there's some great opportunities. One of the impacts of teleworking that we've seen, at least in the financial district of San Francisco, I had a meeting. This young lady and her husband live in a small flat or a small apartment in San Francisco, and they were on a waiting list to move to the financial district prior to this pandemic. And so there was no vacancies. And she was telling me the other day that there are over 100 vacancies in that apartment complex because people don't like to be cooped up in a 300 square foot apartment. So they're heading out to suburbia. So that's more opportunity for us to house more people, but we still have that jobs housing balance.
Right.
And I think the last thing that I wanted to talk about is prior to COVID or the pandemic, we had a self-imposed 10% mode shift goal. And we've gone out and we've got Federal Highway Administration, US DOT's partnering with us on a ATC MTD grant to build a mobility on demand or a MOS platform to help with that connectivity to put more people in transit, less than single occupant vehicles. And so we've just started a travel behavior study along Interstate 680 to find out how do we incentivize that mode shift. Now, in today's climate right now, when we get back to normal, that 10% mode shift goal, if we measure today, is really low. Yeah. But I can remember prior to the pandemic, we were going, how are we going to meet this, Randy? It's very, very difficult at 10%. So we're trying to figure out how to incentivize teleworking. We like teleworking. We think it's effective. And how do we meter the transition back to the office? And does all that have to be done at the same time? So Tilly's part of a group that we're starting to talk to the business community about impacts of going away from teleworking on our transportation system. So we're not only talking amongst ourselves, but we're starting to talk to others that we have traditionally not talked to about how do we partner together to make our transportation system work better. And so I think this is a great opportunity, even though it's a bad time, it's a great opportunity to reimagine our city streets and how they work.
Right. And I think with that's a good transition, I think, to Jarvis, because Jarvis, I mean, even last time, you were already on the forefront of all those new changes that you were doing. You were already talking about your partnerships, getting in your data with your partners. I mean, talking with all those bike and scooter providers, you're on the forefront of all those changes. So is there a possibility that you can highlight what has all changed since our last meeting in March, and what are the things that you want to highlight that we can bring up during this discussion later on?
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you guys for having me, and to all my colleagues on the video call. They're all really great people, so it's fun to be on this panel. So I was one of those people who back in March, I really thought this was going to last, 30 to 90 days max, then we'd all be back to normal by summer. So clearly that's not the case. So this is why I don't gamble. We've had a lot of different things go on, and a lot of what Susan, Randy, and Tilly have said are true in the city of Los Angeles as well. One of the issues that we've had is that, the disparities that have shown up for us, when the pandemic began to hit, we had shelter in place orders like everyone else did. And for that reason, many of our seniors could no longer go out because they were vulnerable populations. They were unable to obtain food. They were food insecure. And, one of the things that happened amongst my taxi drivers, they lost all of their business. Taxis, TNCs, they've all lost a ton of business. Our airport trips were down to virtually nothing, which is really their bread and butter. And so for a while, it seemed as though the taxi business was going to just be completely gone and decimated. But because we've had this food insecurity for our seniors, they ended up transitioning to doing food delivery service. If you had asked my taxi drivers 2 years ago or even a year ago to start delivering food at a flat rate, they all would have, maybe given you the finger to your face and turned around. Whereas today, we have so many drivers sign up to do that work. And again, it's for flat rates to deliver food. And we're doing 3,000 to 4,000 deliveries a day just for those food insecure seniors. So that's been, somewhat of a good thing for them, but it's not 100% sustainable because that's, again, part of a larger program that we have as a city to help those seniors. So it's something that the city is providing on behalf of them. And in terms of being able to continue to provide that, that's going to be a big major challenge for us.
Right.
Some of the other things that we're seeing, though, on the micromobility side, our scooters, they stopped, a lot of the services stopped during the earliest days of the pandemic. We had several providers just suspend operations entirely. But in the last couple of months, since June, July, they've picked up. So there's been a sense of maybe riding a scooter or a bike is safer than being on transit, sharing a ride or doing anything of that nature. So, while our bus services are beginning to come back and they're beginning to, start up again, the ridership on the buses is really looking a lot like essential workers, and people who can are opting to drive. And that's something that, we don't love, on our end, because many people are beginning to buy the used car. They'd rather drive themselves. They don't want to put themselves in that situation. And even my taxi drivers, we were only operating at a third of our capacity because many drivers simply opted to stay at home. I think that's going to change now that the extra $600 that came from the federal government is going away. So I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see an uptick in drivers who don't have a choice. They need to come back. And the city of LA has done a lot of things to try to help people, meaning, we have kind of a rent moratorium if you can't pay your rent, but it's not a waiver of rent. And so one of the challenges that we're looking at is when everything kind of comes due, say December or January, what is all of that going to look like? And it's a little bit scary, I think, for many of our people here in terms of what's going on. So, but we're facing the same things that everyone on the call has already mentioned. People are moving out. Cities are no longer kind of the cool place to be. I recently took a trip up to wine country, and I must have met 5 people who lived there permanently, who lived in San Francisco previously. So, and this was all during the pandemic. They all decided, I'm going to leave and just set up shop out there. So it's very interesting what's going on.
So what about, I think also for the rest of the panel, I mean, if you look at this, it's nice if you have the ability to move out and have the ability to go somewhere, but we've also seen so much social unrest, which is still happening right now, right? So how do we deal with this essential workers and those people being able to get to their jobs? And does it impact our mobility planning, right? Do we look at our mobility planning differently than we did like 6 months ago? Because not everybody can move to the out country, right? And not everybody can probably in San Francisco live at a place that is larger, and they have to just take their job. So what's your thought on that, maybe, Tilly?
Sure, thanks. So I think we're always interested in data, and like Susan and other researchers have often touted, we really have to lead with data, and it's hard to come by, but we do have some information. We know that, for example, on Muni, we have about 160,000 riders per day, still trips per day on Muni, and across the Bay Area, there's data about who are, where the low-income riders are in the region. So we're using that, I think, as a region to try and make sure that as we bring back the transit system, we're doing so in a way that is led by equity. And not just on the transit side, also on the traffic side. Folks who do need to travel are often opting for their cars, as drivers and others mentioned, and that's something we want to try and really make sure we give people the most options as possible to avoid that traffic. But we're seeing the Bay Bridge and even our downtown network start to really congest again. I'm going to share with PTV folks, I don't know if you can share with the participants, but a COVID tracker, a congestion tracker that we published recently. It's really just information that MTC makes available to us from I believe from INRIX on cell phone-based travel time data. So that speed data we're publishing on the transit side and on the traffic side, and you can see in some places congestion is even worse than pre-COVID. And that means people are going to their cars more so than even before the pandemic, for whatever reason. And we know the reasons. I mean, we know that people feel safer and that they and the travel times are great because there's very few trips out there. So one of the things that we're doing in San Francisco, our sister agency again, SFMTA, is doing on the Muni side is taking some of that street space back for buses to lock in some travel time savings that the buses are seeing, 30% in some cases. And so the buses are then able to have dedicated lanes, a larger dedicated lane network around the city. And they're doing this carefully, to ensure that we're not going to create more congestion, but actually just preserve the travel time gains that the buses have seen and the reliability gains. And that's important not only for travel, but also for public health to minimize the exposure that people have, on the buses. And while they're congregating and waiting at the bus stops to try and even out the spacing and avoid bunching. And that way you don't have these big, groups of passengers waiting at the stops either, so that you don't have to expose people that way. And in that way, I think it's a mobility measure. It's also a public health measure to create more dedicated bus lanes in the city.
Right, super. Yeah, and I think just those changes, I think what goes along with that is also like the social distancing and how comfortable are people with being close together and saying like, hey, how can I be in one vehicle at one place? So how does that also saying like, I'm going to, as you're saying, some people are not comfortable using transit. So what do we think that will happen to the mode choice preferences? Will those be lasting changes or will those be things that will go away? And maybe Susan, those are the things that might be coming up in your research already. I would expect that people would want to know, are we all going to be back in Muni and BART next year, or are we all going to be in a car? So be curious to hear if those questions have been arising, and of course what your take on that is.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I think we're living in a time of extreme uncertainty, and so from a research perspective, a lot of the tools that we typically rely on, in addition to the data Tilly mentioned, is scenario-based planning tools. So you can use different types of modal choice models, agent-based and micro-simulation models to help you get a sense of where different directions might go. I'm currently leading a study on behalf of the UC Institute of Transportation Studies and the Transportation Research Board. I think many of you are familiar with that, where we're actually developing a range of scenarios to help us better understand what policy options we might want to put in place and how research can support those possible scenarios in 3 specific timeframes. One being immediate up to the next 12 months, one being more short-term, 2 to 3 years, and then more of a longer-term view. And I know this isn't necessarily longer term, but I think in a time of such uncertainty surrounding COVID, 4 to 6 years. And so these types of tools, I think, can be very, very informative in terms of helping us understand how we could be responding in light of economic pressures and many different changing behavioral directions. Before I wrap up, I wanted to just say is I think one thing we know from research of travel behavior is it's difficult to get people to change their behavior. Randy mentioned that with his study of trying to make a 10% modal shift, how challenging that is. And I think there's gonna be rebounding effects, and we're already seeing this towards auto ownership and towards auto use. And so how do we reinforce things like telework that all of the panelists have discussed, right? How do we reinforce these types of behaviors by creating new partnerships with the employment sector? I think travel behavior has a tendency to want to go back to what it was. And so the longer this goes on, maybe the longer there's going to be behavioral shifts that are lasting. But I think they're not going to be lasting that long unless I think we reinforce them with really good research understanding, metrics, data, and policies.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean those are interesting points to look at and say like, hey, how do we look at those policies and metrics? I can see that when we look at Randy, you can say like, well, what's happening in 4 years from now? But maybe your constituents are not really caring about what's happening in 4 years from now. They're saying, I'm stuck in traffic today. So can you please help me getting out of this mess today? And I'm curious, Randy, how that reflects in your organization, and say like, hey, how do we take those research organization or research topics, but how do you keep it practical so that you guys basically keep everyone being able to go to their jobs? Because I can, and maybe there are some things that you can highlight in that field, of course, and how you make that happen in your county.
So we are trying to redo our models and our planning areas, working with MTC on the travel behavior models, the travel, all the different models that we use to kind of look at into the future. And this is prior to this, it's been unprecedented time with the advancement of technology. And so we are working hard to make sure that our models kind of reflect the future, so that we're working on the right projects. I think we have a couple of projects that we're working on that we're trying, because we had the 10% mode shift goal. It's based on how do we get more transit ridership, more people in shared rides. So we're working on a smarter mobility hubs around the transit centers. How do we make those handoffs so that you don't kill people as they're getting off their scooter trying to get onto BART or onto a shared ride into BART or onto a bus? How do we protect those connections between the modes so it's more convenient to the travelers? We're trying to put buses on shoulder, the outside shoulder. We've got a study underway on Interstate 680, because that 10 feet of pavement, in order to build another 12 feet of pavement on either side of 680 down the length of Interstate 680 all the way to Santa Clara, is billions and billions of dollars, and we just can't afford it. So we're trying to find new ways of moving people. And lastly, we have a first and last mile study. I think in my lifetime, in my career here in transportation, which is over 35 years now, it just seems like yesterday I started. But the automation, that technology is the first technology that I've seen in my career that can help provide transit options or mobility options to the underserved portions of our community. And Susan, until he talked about that, but my mother's 84, or 85. I visited her this weekend. I was trying to hint to her that, Mom, you shouldn't be driving your car anymore around a small rural town in the Central Valley. And she goes, I can drive just fine. I said, well, you're almost 90. You really should be thinking about maybe an assisted care home. She almost threw me out of the house. And so my little sister, not little anymore, but my younger sister, her role is to tell Mom when it's time to quit driving, because I just can't take the pressure. But why not develop technology that can help us with those issues of the elderly, the disabled, and the people that can't afford a car? Let's get them that opportunity. So we're really doing a lot of pilot projects around first and last mile connectivity as well. And I think Tilly and I have talked about her plight at Treasure Island, where you've got all these homes going in, but there's only so many ways. It's the bridge going across, and it's already packed prior to the pandemic. So how do we provide different options for the public to get to and from where they want to go and where they live?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think you're saying to and from where they live. Do you see changes in living patterns? I mean, you kind of hinted already too with Randy about the lady that is living in San Francisco and doesn't want to live on our 300 square feet apartment. Do you see changes in living behavior and housing planning, and more people willing to live in your county? And Jarvis, do you see that change too in LA, and saying like, hey, there's fewer people living in the city and more want to live in other places in the outskirts of the city? What is your view on those things?
Well, Jarvis used to live in the Bay Area, so he can probably give you a better, because when I worked for Caltrans, I never made it below Tehachapi. So I always worked north of the Tehachapi in 4 different districts. I've been to LA, never experienced that crunch, because we complain about traffic in the Bay Area, but it's nowhere near the levels in LA. But in the old days, when BART was constructed in the 60s, people used to get into BART and they'd get out at every stop until the stop where they could afford a house. And then they would go out and buy a house. And we've extended BART now out to Antioch, and people they just authorized an 1,100 home subdivision. And, the people are going out as far as they can go to where they can buy a house. And that hasn't changed over the last 4 or 5 decades. They're still doing that. Mm-hmm. I think what's happening now is the dynamic of being cooped up in your house, because it's okay if you're living a 300 square foot home or a apartment in San Francisco. You go to work, you work all day, you come home, you get freshened up, you go out and you have fun in the city, and then you come home, you sleep, and then you do it again. Well, now there's no going out to the work and going out, partying in San Francisco. You're in that little apartment all day, and you're thinking, is this really worth it? And so you're taking a look at Contra Costa and what Contra Costa has to offer. And what we're concerned about in the transportation business is these super commutes.
Right.
People are living in Tracy, Modesto, Merced in California, and they're taking those 2-hour commutes to visit Tilly in San Francisco because they pay a lot in San Francisco, but the housing is very expensive, so they go further and further out. And so that's really what we're concerned about, is that getting a jobs housing balance, making sure that some of these jobs are located maybe out in the hinterlands, but a lot of local authorities don't want to give those smart jobs up. And I think ultimately they're going to see that some of these things are going to have to change. We're going to have to build densification around BART stops or transit stops, and the locals around the transit stops fight those projects tooth and nail. And so some of these housing issues are going to have to change.
Right. Do you have a view on that as well from an LA point of view there, Jarvis?
Yeah, so I think Randy is exactly right. One of the things, LA has always had sprawl, for as long as I can remember. So, we're somewhat used to that. The difference was that within the last 10, 15 years, many people in LA have begun moving back into the central cores. And now, once COVID has hit, that's beginning to adjust ever so slightly again for people, beginning to go back out to where they were. So LA had this kind of revitalization project. 20 years ago, no one lived downtown LA. Today, there's all these beautiful condos in the middle of downtown LA, and people were moving in. We are not nearly as expensive as San Francisco, but we're getting there. But right now, it's slowed down, and you're beginning to see a lot of vacancies where you can go to some of these more denser places. Like I live in Koreatown in Los Angeles, which is a very dense area, and vacancies are super high, whereas previously we were all crammed in here. So that is something that's happening here. But one thing I do want to point out, and I think it's important, is that despite whatever's going on with COVID, I think the important thing that we are trying to focus on here in LA is that it doesn't mean that things stop. It doesn't mean that we change we need to change and be flexible in terms of how we're looking at what we're doing, but it doesn't mean that we stop working on the projects that we think are going to better the city. So, for example, we recently did, kind of a program where we figured out what we call mobility disadvantage zones, which are focused primarily on kind of transit deserts in LA, as well as equity zones, which are kind of our transit deserts plus socioeconomically depressed. And one of the things that we found in just doing that kind of map overlay was that, when we look at mobility disadvantage, it wasn't just, poor communities. It was also wealthier areas, because essentially many of those areas don't necessarily have buses or transit, and some of that's deliberate. Let's be honest about some of that. And we're still looking at so then when the question is, well, how do we change people from wanting to buy the car now? We're still trying to find ways, whether it's, through autonomous vehicles in the future or something of that nature, to get people to not take the personal car. So even in those areas where you ostensibly will look at it and say, well, they're middle class or upper middle class, they don't need this. We're trying to look at it and say, no, leave the Mercedes, the Tesla, the Audi at home. Here's a good way to get around still without contributing to the greenhouse gas. So we're worried about the entire city. But what that also means, in terms of the telework, is the thing we don't know is who's going where. And with the commutes right now, there really isn't a lot of commute. LA still has traffic, but nowhere near what we had previously. So you could still right now drive the 405 and actually move compared to the constant stop of what it used to be. And I don't know, honestly, if many of the businesses are going to maintain commercial property. They may be able to save money. I know that, especially in the Bay Area, many of the high tech firms, I think Facebook and Twitter, I think, has already said no one comes back to the office ever again after opening that huge market, that office in mid-market. And I think that's going to be the case for many businesses here. And so now the question is, where is everyone going to go? Where is everyone going to live? And it always comes back to, I think, what everyone's mentioned here. There's an affordable housing conundrum that we're all kind of stuck with right now. And I don't have the answer to that, but that's the thing right now. Like, where can people live? Where can they afford it?
Right. Do you see, because of that also, as you're saying, hey, we're doing things differently, people are traveling differently, do you see different types of partnerships, for example, coming up because you cannot maybe drive the buses around as they were before, because maybe they have to touch certain places more and other places less, but there might also be more combinations of on-demand transportation, having more combinations of different providers, not just a bus system, but a combination of bus and on-demand with more core services and things like this. So do you see a change there, and also in the type of partnerships that you have with either with LA Metro or the private sector there, Jarvis?
Absolutely. And the thing that we've all begun to see is that, everyone is suffering across the board, whether it's our private businesses or even the public entities. And so we're all trying to find ways to work together to make a lot of those things happen, So we definitely are working more with Metro, and even with the food delivery program, that's in conjunction with the mayor's office. We're talking with businesses about, can we centralize our dispatch? A lot of things that were difficult before, people are coming to the table and saying, hey, what can we do to maintain sustainability? Because right now things aren't feeling super comfortable or super sustainable. And so I think that there is a lot of room for that. And really, I think the challenge that we are having here in LA is that we are trying to get the data to understand exactly what it is that we need to do. We don't want to just make policy in the dark anymore.
Right.
For us, my boss, Salita Reynolds, she always says data is the new concrete.
Right.
And part of that is us needing to begin digitizing what we have, whether it's digitizing a curve, understanding, where our equity zones should be, but not just kind of shot in the dark, but more like, hey, what does the data show? Who's going where? What's happening here? Do we need more package delivery? Should we have a KiwiBot sidewalk delivery in these areas? There's all these questions that I think we hope can at least be mostly answered through data. So.
Right. So do I hear that there's going to be a new data standard, more than the MDS that you put in place for the shared mobility? There's going to be more for deliveries and possibly curbside too?
Quite possibly, yes. And I don't know if it's a new data standard, but an expansion of how we're using that data. So the MDS on the micromobilities is kind of the tip of the iceberg. Everyone thinks that this is about dockless, and yeah, that was a way for it to get started. But ultimately, we're looking at it for taxi and all of our other modes, and learning how to digitize our curbs and how to push policies that way through a digital mechanism.
Wow. Yeah. I mean,
I just want to say that the mobility data specification is really groundbreaking, and it's been adopted all over the world now. So it is, Jarvis, tip of the iceberg with the micromobility companies being willing to share that data, and it has the potential to expand to so many different modes.
Exactly. Yeah, and we see it as well.
Right. Enabling to do the different modeling that Randy was talking about, probably, and saying like, hey, understanding how do we move forward from this, right? So with just a few more minutes for our discussion, I was just curious. I mean, we hear so often in the news that there is so many financial impacts, right? So I'm very curious to hear, like, what is the impact over the last few months on the financial side? We see like ridership is down, so there's no fare revenues. Maybe there's fewer products sold in states. There's maybe no congestion charging because people are not using the roads. Some cities we hear like they're not funded anymore. So I'd be curious to hear from all of you also, like, how does the financial situation impact you, and how are you dealing with this in making sure that you keep the service sustainable? And maybe Tilly can get a first shot at that, if that's okay with you, right?
Sure, it's a great question. Thank you. Well, okay, so fares are certainly down, and in some cases dramatically down. So we definitely all need Congress and the administration to please work together and pass some more additional COVID relief. I'm not sure what number of trillions makes sense, but certainly states and local government, transit agencies, toll operators, we're all really hurting. Now that said, because congestion did start creeping back on at least on the bridges and on the express lanes, MTC did turn back on, our regional agency did turn back on the bridge tolls and the express lanes. And that's a sign of really being sort of performance driven. So it's really not a matter of anything other than the conditions in the lanes. And so that's an indication that we do want to support economic recovery so that we can all generate more sales tax. And so Randy can have more money and I can have more money and all the sales tax agencies in California and those of us who use property and sales and other kinds of taxes to fund our transportation infrastructure can get back on with it. We also have a new TNC tax that was approved by voters a couple of years ago. It's not generating very much at all, but it is helpful here and there, and we want them to we want to be able to track that because that data or that revenue, 3.25% tax on each TNC trip generated within San Francisco will help Muni for its operating services as well as Vision Zero safety projects on the capital side. That said, it's a very small and modest fund source. Really what we're hoping for is our sales tax to come back. And interestingly, we're pretty much on target with where fiscal 20 ended up, which is June, as of June 2020. We were about 20% down for the year. Of course, that only reflected, mid-March till June. And going forward, we're hoping to, we'll see what the numbers are. It's hard to say. It's really, really hard to say. But in that tourism is down, yes, we also do see other spending is up. So oddly, it's not as bad as we had feared, but that might just be the effect of some of the unemployment support that some of the families around the country were getting until recently. It just ended. So it's really hard to say, and we'll have to keep track of that. The region is also still working on new revenues measures. In fact, just last week, our region came together and authorized placement of a 1/8 cent sales tax for Caltrain, and that is a permanent sort of 30-year tax for Caltrain improvements and services. And so hopefully that will pass at the ballot in November. And so we'll probably see revenue measures in addition going forward for transportation.
So, and so how did it impact you, Randy, from a county point of view? More looking at like was there a big financial impact, and what did you see happening over the last course of the months? And maybe what recommendations do you have for other counties and cities to make sure that they keep their balanced, basically, right?
So volume's down, so we're relying on sales tax on gasoline, excise tax on gasoline for our 19 cities in the county here. And it's starting to creep back. We track the congestion levels and the peak hours back to the peak hour, as Tilly was mentioning. It's not the 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour delay kind of a situation, but there are a lot of people on the road, and the hotspots are showing up in places that it didn't used to be. But if you travel on Interstate 680 heading northbound, snow grades bad through Fremont just as normal, and you get into Walnut Creek, and where you have 24 merging, so you have all this weaving. You have a backup all the way back to San Ramon. So, it's back to normal. So the gasoline taxes are coming back. And the sales tax, much like Tilly, it was a funny story. In January, we were looking at the economy smoking hot. We said, we're going to raise our revenue projections from 91.2 million to, we thought it was going to go to 96 million for our 1.1 million people in our county. We put in the budget and got it approved, $93 million. So few percentage point increase. We're all happy. March hits, and then we downgrade that to 80.5. So it's a 14% drop. This year's budget is down to 76 million. What's happening though is this e-commerce is I don't know what's going on in our county, but once again, we're a suburban county, 1.1 million people. But you get 12 payments from the state of sales tax, and our 11th sales tax, our payment, we're almost up to 90 million. And so people are buying things that maybe cars, or we're trying to analyze what the situation is to then go ahead and try to make it easier to spend more of those dollars in the future. But we're almost back to where we were in our original budget allocation of 91.2 million. I wanted to say this. I think that today, Tilly has been working on, and she didn't mention this, but I've always kind of watched this cordon pricing. So all lane tolling is this the right opportunity to start putting in safeguards so that we don't go back to where we are and try to incentivize people getting to and maybe do a different kind of an incentive to get people to share rides and get into transit in the future. So from a revenue perspective, yes, we are down. We are looking at it as an opportunity to be more efficient. We invested in software packages a few years ago to go paperless, and that really saved us because we're at home and we're just as efficient. Other than cutting checks, we're just as efficient as we were before because we can, the cloud storage, we don't print plans and specifications, we do online bidding and all that. And that wasn't set up for the pandemic. That was set up for us to save money on buying all this paper for all the paper packets that we were printing. And it just morphed into e-signatures, all these different software and hardware packages that made the transition for us to go into shelter-in-place mode. That was a wise investment for us. We're probably more lucky than good, but I mean, it's really helped us a lot.
So yeah, it's just amazing to see how many changes have just taken place over the last months, really, right? I mean, as we started off with, what we thought that was never possible has been realized in a way, sometimes for the worse, but maybe most time for the better, right? We've seen changes in work. Hopefully the jobs will come back. I think that's the most critical thing, of course, for those in need. We've seen changes in travel behavior where mode shifts, I mean, we were never thinking that like we would meet the VMT goals by 40% working from home, and now we see that as 40% is working from home. We see new partnerships that we never thought of that would possibly work, right? Because as we mentioned here, everyone is in need and we're willing to help each other, bringing things together. The e-commerce is at a place where we'd never thought it would be in the next 5 years. And even though revenues are down on the one hand, they might be up on the other hand. So maybe that balances each other's out. And of course, all those new technologies, how can we use them to bring each other together, right? So I don't know how the future will look like, of course, and what will happen over the next 4 months. That's why we have Susan on the panel, I guess, right? So we just keep asking her over the next months. But I think with that, I would like to just close this off as our discussion and just give our audience a few minutes for questions that they have to you as a panel, because I don't think they get an opportunity to speak to such a knowledgeable panel. So I would already like to thank you, of course, for your time and for your input, because I think this type of information is very valuable for people in the industry and seeing how do we bring our industry further forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if there is questions that should be coming up in the chat box. So hopefully there are some questions out there. Let me see if I can maximize my screen here for that matter, so that I can see them. Because I'm not, it looks like I have to learn a little bit about the technology here. I guess I see it in a very little screen. See if there's questions from the audience.
I don't see any there.
No.
Ariane, that's in your private chat. It was sent as a private message, so just look in the chat tab.
Yeah, I have one question here from Prem Raj Kumar Fanguri, and he's asking, due to the pandemic, most of the people are not likely to travel in public transportation. Everyone planning their journey in their own personal vehicle, bikes and cars, mostly opting for cars. If this continues, it leads to congestion. What can traffic engineers do to tackle this challenge?
Okay.
Let's see.
Well, let me take a stab at that, because when I worked for Caltrans, I had traffic operations and maintenance and research and the equipment shop when I was a deputy director. And one of the complaints I have is that the systems that we have in most major cities are not dynamic, the signal systems. And so the other day I'm stopped at a stoplight and there's nobody around, and I'm literally stopped. And then the fixed timing that are on these signals are set up well before COVID. And so if they're not dynamic, they're on a fixed demand-based, or not a demand-based, but fixed time. They're way out of sync. And somehow in America, we have to get the money available to start modernizing these signal systems, because they do not respond well to untypical situations. And that's what we've been in for the last 5 months.
Okay. Anyone else? Tilly, you want to highlight some?
Sure. I certainly think that timing, signal timing, and all the traditional tools for traffic engineering come into play, but I also want to bring us back to ideas that Randy and I discussed earlier around giving the efficient modes, space efficient modes, and sustainable modes more priority on the street. And so today we see, bus on shoulder, we see East Bay BRT. I want to give a shout out to AC Transit, which just started its BRT project over the weekend, long awaited, exciting project in the East Bay. And that's a dedicated lane, for fast, frequent, reliable transit. We have, the need for active transportation networks and micromobility networks, and the opportunity to create those now, and to support that with the right signage, the right signaling, the right traffic calming on adjacent streets, to manage diversions. So it's a grand experiment. We shouldn't be, I think, we shouldn't hesitate to experiment. We should certainly monitor, and we should listen to people and consult with neighbors along the way, but we should be bold. And I'm really proud that our SFMTA's Transportation Recovery Plan is a model for anybody who wants to look it up. There are other models in other cities doing exciting and bold things out of necessity, really, as well, but also because they do want to try and preserve some of the healthy shifts that have happened and support economic recovery, but because we cannot recover if everyone flocks to their cars. And we know that that's a risk already. Pricing is another thing. Of course, Randy mentioned that we are doing a downtown congestion pricing study. It was a difficult topic, but our 35-member policy advisory committee has encouraged us to keep going, even though it's a tough issue right now. But because of the inequity that comes with congestion and the opportunity to reset some of that toward a healthier, more equitable city. Thanks.
Thank you, Tilly. I have another question from Amit Kumar Singh. What are we expecting in terms of rider willingness to take transit in the future? Can we confidently convey that transit will be safe from virus and other diseases? Will there be any liability issues in the future for transit authorities? Right? Maybe Jarvis, even though you're not in transit, but you're the contracted services, how would you want to respond to something like this, right? Because if the contracted services, do you see also changes? I'm going to add on to that a little bit. Do you see also changes in steering people to other shared modes, or how do you look at this and maybe make people see that there's other options available, and how do you steer that in a direction that you would like it to go?
It's a good question, and I think one of the first things we started out with is working on sanitation protocols across the board. So whether it's a bus or taxis or micromobility, we immediately had to put together, well, what's going to be the standard? What's going to be the new standard practice for cleaning, all of these different modes? So that was the first thing we were able to do. And I know that different bus lines have done different things, such as LA has only recently begun to open up rear door boarding instead of you coming in into the front and everyone cramming in. But the challenge, though, which is where this question I think leads to, is that you really can't manage social distancing on a bus. It's going to be very difficult unless you're going to add a whole lot more buses. But I feel like you'll have people waiting, and then it becomes another issue. So it's really about just giving them the confidence of knowing that the buses or the taxis or your micromobility will be sanitized properly prior to you getting on, and then hoping, it sounds silly, but I want to say trusting people, but we found that in America we can't trust ourselves, but trusting people to do the right thing in terms of their own safety protocols, and that includes wearing the mask and keeping their hands clean and doing their best not to touch their faces and things of that nature. So there is no perfect solution for that. It's really just going to be a matter of us taking the extra time to make sure that everything is as clean as it can possibly be, and then allowing the people to, manage their own safety as well. Right.
Well, I think with that, at the top of the hour, I see we only have like 30 seconds left before we really at the top of the hour. So I think with that, I would just like to thank this very knowledgeable panel for taking part of this and for spending your time with the audience. And hopefully there will be another time, and hopefully that will be again in 5 months, when we'll be saying, what were we all talking about? Everything was like in March, everything was on March 10th. and nothing has really changed, or we live in a completely different world. I think Susan's studies will probably highlight that most of all of us. And Tilly, I'm hopefully for you, of course, you'll be able to provide services to everybody who needs it and also everybody who wants it, right? And Jarvis, you can put into place all those partnerships and data standards that will bring the world further. And Randy, you will just implement all those technologies by March 10. So I would say at your next Redefining Mobility conference, we'll have the summary of all the good things that have happened, right? So let's keep it like that. With that, I would like also to thank the audience and everyone who tuned in, right? For those who sent questions that we couldn't answer, we'll make an effort to answer the questions in the next few days. You can always check out Shaping Mobility for the next webinar, which will be on September 22nd. The focus will be Suburbia No More, Reviving the Main Street. And here from Washington, D.C., thank you. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you, panelists. This was a pleasure. So hopefully we'll have more opportunities to see and meet each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.